Rubio, Fetterman, and Hawley. This bipartisan legislation is focused on learning the lessons from East Palestine and helping us to avoid future accidents. No community should have to go through the trauma and evacuation and environmental damage that East Palestine had to go through, especially when you can prevent these from happening. In the weeks after the derailment, bipartisan group of senators visited East Palestine. They listened to the residents, to railway workers and first responders, and heard some of those people who then later testified before our committee last March. Through them, we learned the lessons and to make sure that we can implement better safety. We learned from East Palestine that derailments and the improvement of detectors could help prevent these future derailments. This legislation requires for the first time railroads to use these defect detectors with more frequency and makes it not just voluntary, but a requirement. It also establishes rules for the minimum distance that they have to be placed, focusing on the fact that in urban areas is where you have great concern, and requires the implementation of those rules by the Federal Railroad Administration. We learned that not enough trains carrying hazardous material are treated with care that they deserve under this legislation. More trains will be subject to the stringent safety requirements, including trains with carrying vinyl chloride gas. That was one of the elements in the East Palestine derailment. In my home state, our communities are all too familiar with this issue. Derailments of trains operated by Class 1 railroads have doubled in the past 10 years. And this year alone, we've already seen one that leaked diesel into a sensitive ecosystem in Padilla Bay along the Swinomish Tribal Reservation. People should not have to worry about what's being transported through their communities. Governor DeWine of Ohio said, quote, "We don't truly know how much hazardous material is transported on Ohio rails every day, month, or year," end quote. This legislation requires railroads to share that information with states. This legislation ensures properly trained mechanics will have the time that they need to do their job right. A Wall Street Journal investigation showed us that the current rail car inspection and maintenance practice aren't enough. Some railroads encourage inspectors to spend as little as 30 seconds to inspect one side of a rail car. And to put that into context, a rail car can be 65 feet long, and there can be well over 100 cars. So this requirement also helps us to improve the inspection process. We learned in the East Palestine incident that the conductor played a key role as a first responder. This legislation requires at least a 2-man crew member on board, while the train can be as long as 2 miles long, and to have the person on board responds in event of emergency. We learned that local firefighters need better equipment to fight hazardous materials, while the Norfolk Southern is reimbursing first responders. I think everyone can agree that firefighters should never be left holding the tab. And this law makes more money available to those brave responders out of an existing program. We are increasing the maximum fine for violating rail safety laws from $100,000 to $10 million. At our March hearing, East Palestine resident Misty Allison testified about the trauma she and her family endured. Miss Allison had just lost her mother to cancer a few weeks before, but she wanted to come to the committee anyway. She wanted to tell us, quote, "I urge all of you to support common sense safety regulation so this doesn't happen again," end quote. This is such an important bipartisan legislation. I thank our colleagues for their work on it. I thank our staffs for working on it. I know that we will continue to work on this bill as we move through the process. So I encourage all our colleagues to continue to stay posted so that we get this job done. During this markup, we will also consider S-229, the Securing Semiconductor Supply Chain Act of 2023, co-sponsored by Senators Peters, Blackburn, and Tester. This bill directs Select USA, a program within the Department of Commerce, to review state efforts to attract foreign investment relevant to the semiconductor industry. We will consider S-1280, the Testing Rapid Analysis and Narcotic Quality Research Act of 2023. This is co-sponsored by Senator Cruz and Welch, which would direct the National Institute of Standards to support research on novel synthetic opioids and new psychoactive substances of concern. We will consider 3 bills to improve NOAA weather forecasting and improve hazardous communications within communities across the United States. S-1284, the Tornado Observation, Research, and Notification Assessment for Development of Operations Act, co-sponsored by Senators Wicker, Cruz, Thune, Young, Blackburn, and Peters, and 2 bills co-sponsored by myself and Senator Cruz, S-1414, the National Weather Service Communication Improvement Act, and S-1416, the NOAA Weather Radio Modernization Act. These bills help promote communication of extreme weather and hazardous events to ensure that we are a weather-ready nation. The committee will also consider a number of Coast Guard promotions. I now turn to the ranking member, Senator Cruz, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As the chair just noted, today we're going to be voting on 6 bills and Coast Guard promotions for 315 mid-grade officers. I'm grateful to Chair Cantwell and her staff for working with me and my staff to move several bipartisan bills in this markup. There are three bills I want to briefly mention. First, I'm pleased that we're going to be marking up the Trank Research Act of 2023, which I introduced along with Senator Welch. The drug epidemic continues to ravage communities in Texas and across the country, and to protect our citizens, we need to work swiftly to prevent deadly new drugs like Trank and the truly horrifying side effects that come with it. This bill would improve our knowledge of these devastating drugs so that law enforcement and others on the front line of this battle have better information about when Trank shows up in a community. Secondly, I'm also pleased that we'll be marking up 2 bills that will help the people of Texas by modernizing the nation's weather communications and radio service. I was glad to join Senator Cantwell in introducing the NOAA Weather Radio Modernization Act and the National Weather Service Communications Improvement Act. When severe storms take out communication systems in Texas and other states, we need reliable hazard communication systems to inform them about how to stay safe. Now, turning to the Railway Safety Act. This bill was introduced in the aftermath of the shocking derailment of a Norfolk Southern train in East Palestine, Ohio. All of us were moved by the testimony of the witnesses. I found particularly moving the testimony of a resident from East Palestine, Miss Misty Allison. At the time of the hearing, I made clear to Norfolk Southern that we expected that they would pay for the damage that was caused to the residents of East Palestine and the surrounding areas, that it was not their fault, and the railroad had an obligation to make them whole. I was pleased to announce yesterday that Norfolk Southern CEO Alan Shaw signed a letter committing to me and committing to this committee in writing to compensate homeowners near the derailment site for the reduction in their property values. Norfolk Southern committed to establish a fund that will make whole those residents who sell their homes for less than the pre-derailment appraised value. I thank Norfolk Southern for making that commitment. We will be holding them to that commitment, but that is major progress for ensuring justice for the homes and the families injured by that horrific derailment. Since the derailment, my colleague Senator Vance has been an indispensable voice for rural Ohioans, and I applaud his commitment to his constituents. In March, Senator Vance joined Senator Brown in introducing the bill that is before us today. I said at our hearing later that month that my staff and I would work diligently towards an agreement on policies that improve safety and protect communities, while at the same time not damaging our supply chain or imposing unreasonable costs that would ultimately make products more expensive for families. We all recognize this bill has changed since it was introduced. It's gone from 18 pages to a substitute that's nearly 80 pages long. I earnestly hope that we would reach a bipartisan consensus, and I applaud the substantial work by Senator Cantwell, Senator Vance, and their staff that's gone into this bill. They are to be commended for their efforts and their passion. But unfortunately, at this stage, I cannot support the result. I remain concerned that this bill is overly and needlessly prescriptive in certain places. In particular, I worry that these numerous new rulemakings and authorities empower Secretary Buttigieg and the Biden administration to further and aggressively restrict the movement of American energy products. The many regulatory requirements of this bill would always carry some risk of harm to our supply chain and increased cost to American consumers. I think that was a trade many of us were willing to make for improved rail safety. But without sufficient guide rails in the hands of overzealous Biden bureaucrats, the bill's new mandates in this bill would make it much easier for this administration to restrict the transportation of coal, of oil, of natural gas, and of ethanol. And the burdens on moving these commodities would carry over to the many other trains in the rail network that carry crops and building materials and cars to market. That means more time and cost to deliver everything from industrial chemicals to orange juice. With these potential consequences in mind, I'm very concerned about giving broad authority to the Biden administration to write these new rules. Without guardrails in place, such as a clear requirement for the prescriptive rulemakings to be cost-effective, President Biden and Secretary Buttigieg would have a free hand to aggressively restrict the movement of coal, oil, natural gas, ethanol, and other essential commodities that the radical green movement hates. Of course, consumers will still demand these and other commodities, but at some point it becomes too costly to move by rail, and so trucking will become more attractive. The likely result of increasing rail costs and network congestion is the diversion of the shipment of hazardous materials from trains to trucks. Data clearly shows that on average, transportation by truck consumes more fuel, carries a greater risk of an accident with a hazardous material release, and a greater threat to the traveling public than transportation by rail. Last year, there were 355 hazmat spills by rail. That's 355 too many. But there were more than 23,000 hazmat spills by truck. In the current form of this bill, the measure to, quote, improve rail safety may come at the expense of transportation safety overall. Again, I'm disappointed we weren't able to reach agreement on a targeted bipartisan rail safety bill, but I remain hopeful that between now and final passage, we will reach that agreement. I think this bill, as written, it's going to pass this committee, but I don't believe it's as written it is likely to get 60 votes in the Senate, and I think it is even less likely as written to pass the House of Representatives. So I remain committed to working with the authors of this bill and with the chairwoman to find a bill that both enhances safety but also does not result in dramatically driving up the cost of energy for consumers who are being hurt today.
Thank you. I turn to Senator Vance for a motion.
Yeah, so thanks to the Madam Chair and the ranking member. You know, I never done this before, but I move that S576, the Railway Safety Act 2023, as amended by the Cantwell-Vance substitute, is modified. Blackburn 2 is modified. Bud 2 is modified. Bud 4, Hicklin-Hooper 1 is modified. Peters 1 is modified. Thune 2 is modified. Warnock 4 is modified. Warnock 6 is modified. And Welch 2 is modified. Be reported favorably out of the committee.
Is there a second?
Madam Chair.
Thank you. Yes. Is there discussion? Now we expect amendments to that. Yep.
Madam Chair,
Senator Vance, would you like to make any comments?
I would, and I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks again to the chair and to the ranking member for their work on this. Let me just start by trying to walk anyone who's listening through what the firefighters in East Palestine dealt with on the evening of the crash. This is a nearly all volunteer firefighting force, and they were asked to go into a burning inferno, not knowing what they were actually dealing with. Now, they learned later, that a number of hazardous chemicals were on board the train. They had no notice of that going in. They did their duty, and it's time for all of us on this committee and in this body to do ours. The first thing that this bill does, and in my view, the most important thing this bill does, is it ensures that our firefighters and our first responders have proper notice. We cannot ask our rural communities or our big cities to send their first responders into a train crash that they didn't cause, no fault of their own, without actually knowing what they're dealing with. That is the first and most important thing this legislation does, but it does a couple of other things as well. The second thing our legislation does, I would draw attention to, is that it provides enhanced safety inspections and monitoring to ensure what happens in East Palestine doesn't happen again, or at least, at the very least, to make it less likely. We heard the leadership of the American Association of Railroads. I admire their honesty for this, for admitting that 30 seconds is not nearly enough time to inspect a rail car before it goes into our communities. Our legislation would make these inspections more rigorous. It would actually enable there to be more time for these inspections, and it would make it more likely that inspectors catch the things that cause these trains to go off the tracks in the first place. The second thing that it does is encourage the installation of hot box detectors all around our country so that the very thing that caused the East Palestine train to crash is noticed and fixed before it causes a chemical bomb to go off in communities like those in East Palestine. Now, let me say here, what happened in East Palestine cannot be undone. We cannot reverse it. We cannot change it. We cannot undo the psychological, economic, and physical toll of the derailment in East Palestine, but I guarantee you, whether it's tomorrow or next week or next year, there will be another East Palestine in this country if we do not pass the Railway Safety Act. It's that simple. Train crashes over the last 10 years have gone up 25% in our freight train across all rail since 2020. That we have had more crashes successively, year after year for 3 years. Our rail system is becoming less safe, not more safe. We have the technology and we have the tools to change that. This bill does it, and we need to see it through. Now, I've heard a lot from my colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, about this legislation over the last couple of months. I've learned a lot about rail regulation and rail safety that I never thought that I would know 6 months ago. This bill has changed a lot from what I introduced just a few short months ago. We've made a number of concessions to industry, a number of concessions to the rail industry, a number of concessions to various interest groups, which is why we have so much bipartisan support in this body, but also why we have a lot of support from industry. I want to address, we also have, by the way, the support of the Heritage Foundation. We have the support of Russ Vought, one of the most important leaders in the conservative movement. We have the support of Donald Trump, the former president, who had a deep emotional connection to the people of East Palestine and is asking this committee not for vague promises from industry, but that we get something done, that we do the job of legislators and actually legislate. I want to address just two concerns the ranking member addressed, and I might go a little over my time. I hope that's okay, Madam Chair. The first is this question of whether this bill will make it harder and will empower the Biden administration to prevent the transportation of coal and of other materials by rail. I don't think that's a fair characterization of our legislation. In fact, if you look at the number of industry groups, including the Chemical Council, that have come out in support of our legislation, they would not be supporting it if they thought it would make it impossible to transport their product by rail. Yes, it may make rail transportation a little bit more expensive, but it's going to make rail transportation a little bit more expensive in the service of safety, because let's be honest, we have allowed the rail industry to socialize the risk of their business while privatizing the rewards. The people of East Palestine are going to deal with the costs of what Norfolk Southern did for the next generation. The mental health costs, the physical health costs, the economic damage, the loss of home and property values, they will be dealing with this for 20 years hence. The least that we can do is make it less likely that the next East Palestine happens in our communities. We cannot, on the one hand, acknowledge that Ohio taxpayers and Ohio citizens are bearing the cost of this accident, and on the other hand, say it's ridiculous to require the rail industry to do a little bit more on safety. They should be doing more on safety. They should be incurring some additional costs so that another East Palestine doesn't happen again. The final point that I want to make here is the ranking member talked about the discretion given to the Biden administration. The ranking member himself has supported a number of pieces of legislation, even out of this committee, that give plenty of discretion to the Biden administration, including giving the Biden administration discretion over things like capital gains tax cuts for tech CEOs. If we can give the secretary discretion over capital gains tax cuts for CEOs, surely we can give the secretary discretion to make communities like East Palestine safer. I think it's ridiculous to say that we're going to discover a principle when that principle would protect the people of East Palestine and ignore that principle when it benefits tech CEOs and others who get capital gains tax cuts. So let's do something here. Let's not rely on vague promises. Let's not send out celebratory press releases because industry has finally decided to make a promise, not to follow through on that promise, but to make a promise. Let's actually do something for the people of East Palestine and all across our country. Let's get the Railway Safety Act done. It's common sense. It's a very narrow piece of legislation tailored to what we need to do to make rail safety a reality in this country. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Klobuchar.
Yeah, well said, Senator Vance, well said. I appreciate your willingness to work with Senator Brown. I appreciate the fact that you have gotten a number of conservatives on your bill in the Senate, including as co-sponsors, Senator Rubio, Senator Hawley, Senator Marshall, Senator Braun, and of course, a number of Democrats as well. And as you know, I'm a co-sponsor because one, I thought it was a good idea to begin with, but two, just a few weeks after the disaster in Ohio, we had a train derail in Raymond, Minnesota, which is a town of 800 residents. Different situation in many ways. It was biofuels, and so they were able to burn off without any toxic contamination. Two, the ground was frozen, as it has been for a long time in Minnesota this last winter. Three, we had a different rail company, and maybe because of the work of Senator Vance and Senator Brown and the horror, what people were seeing in TV, reacted very differently and had people there immediately cleaning up, including the CEO. And by the end of about 2 days, the trains were running again. That being said, I went there along with Senator Smith and Representative Fischbach, and I saw firsthand there were like 25 burned out, mangled cars. And if the train had gone just a little further, the investigation's going on, we don't know. It's probably a very different cause than what we saw in Ohio. It would have gone right into the number of huge grain elevators right in the middle of the town. And there's no way they wouldn't have caught on fire because the tracks were going right by it. So I just want to echo the words of Senator Vance on this. If you really want to make a difference, you have to make a difference. You can't just do small ball things that aren't going to make a difference when you have firefighters in the middle of the night having to risk their lives and go into this situation. I want to thank him for his words and his courage in moving forward with this bill.
Further discussion or amendments?
Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator Cruz.
Madam Chair, I call up Cruz 1. One of the top priorities of Texans and many Americans is ensuring that America is energy independent and energy dominant. And we cannot do that when we have regulations from this administration that discriminate against American energy, even when it has a risk profile similar to that of other commodities. In Texas, we proudly produce the most oil and natural gas in the country, followed by states like Pennsylvania and West Virginia. I cannot overstate how important it is to Texas to keep this country and the world moving. That energy, however, does not magically move around the country. It has to be transported, and there are only a limited number of choices. It can be transported by pipeline, by vessel, by rail, or truck. We move many hazardous commodities by rail, including liquefied petroleum gas, liquefied hydrogen, liquefied ethylene, but not liquefied natural gas. And not anytime soon, because the Biden administration believes LNG consumption undermines their Green New Deal climate alarmist agenda. That's why in 2021, the Biden administration suspended a rulemaking that would have allowed railroads to transport LNG, subject to certain safety requirements. This is a huge problem for transporting energy because investing in the tank cars and facilities for moving LNG by rail is expensive and time-consuming. Additionally, LNG providers have to enter into long-term contracts with buyers to ensure that it's profitable to make the investments to transport LNG. By creating regulatory uncertainty, this administration has effectively pocket vetoed the movement of LNG by rail. This is despite the fact that there are fewer hazmat incidents by rail than there are by truck, by a large degree. In fact, the Federal Railroad Administration's website currently says, quote, "Rail transportation of hazardous materials in the United States is recognized to be the safest land-based method of moving large quantities of chemicals over long distances." That's not to say we shouldn't move commodities by truck as well. But if safety and prosperity are our goals, we must recognize that Americans will be both safer and more prosperous after enabling the transportation of all energy commodities, including LNG. Just to provide one example of where it could be useful, Massachusetts currently imports natural gas through the Everett terminal in Boston from countries like Algeria and Trinidad. That LNG is then shipped by truck across the state. My amendment would say that American LNG, rather than foreign LNG moving on our highways, could be shipped safely in new tank cars that meet strict safety standards. And this amendment is designed to improve safety in three ways. First, it would update the tank car requirements for all cryogenic liquids, including LNG, satisfying a safety recommendation made by the Transportation Research Board. Second, it would require between 5 and 8 buffer cars between the locomotive and a cryogenic tank car carrying LNG, providing space between the crew and the first tank car. Third, it would shift some of our LNG off our highways where it currently travels, particularly in blue states that prevent the construction of pipelines. This amendment would also provide regulatory certainty for the movement of all Class 2.1 cryogenic liquids by imposing a non-discrimination requirement. Whatever the rules are for moving other flammable gases by rail, the same rule should apply to the movement of liquefied ethylene, liquefied hydrogen, and LNG. With our allies right now starved for energy and our adversaries capitalizing on it, it's past time to set aside the alarmist rhetoric of the radical left. We all know that the major reason CO2 emissions have declined precipitously in the United States is because of increased natural gas production. If you care about the environment, increased natural gas production shifting away from coal is enormously beneficial to the environment. We should allow American energy products to move in the same terms as all similar commodities that are essential to modern life. And I would note this is not a partisan amendment. In fact, I'm pleased to have worked on it with one of the major railroad unions, Smart Transportation Division. The people whose lives depend on the safe movement of freight by rail clearly see the benefit of safely transporting LNG on their trains. We should listen to them. We have to transport products that can be dangerous but necessary for life. For example, chlorine is typically shipped by rail for cleaning our drinking water. We can have a fair debate about the proper rules for moving hazardous gases, but we should not draw arbitrary distinctions between American energy products and other commodities. And let me note, the proponents of this bill suggest that it has nothing to do with energy. But I would note that this administration, and in particular Secretary Buttigieg's agency, is staffed with radicals who hate American energy production. This bill directs those radicals to engage in rulemakings. If they engage in rulemakings, here's what we can anticipate. We can anticipate rulemakings designed to dramatically drive up the cost of transporting American energy in the United States. That is their political agenda. The consequence for consumers, if that were to happen, would be paying much more at the gas pump every week when you fill up your truck or your car, would be paying much more to heat your home, would be paying much more to live ordinary lives. Given the ravages of inflation, empowering radicals to attack American energy production and perversely make us more dependent on foreign energy is counterproductive. Now, I offered to the proponents of this bill to include this amendment in the bill, which I think would dramatically enhance the chances of passage of the bill both in terms of getting 60 votes on the floor of the Senate, but also significantly in terms of being likely to pass the House of Representatives. But unfortunately, at least to date, the proponents have declined this offer. Given that, I cannot support the bill, but at the time I'm going to offer, and now I'm going to withdraw the amendment and not call for a vote right now on this amendment. But I will say this, if the proponents want this bill to pass, I am more than ready to work with them. The proponents claim this is not about discriminating against American energy, where there's an easy way to do that, which is to make clear it's not going to empower the administration to discriminate against American energy. Now, I have a second amendment as well. Do you want me to do that?
Yes, thank you.
All right, I'd now like to call up Cruise 7. Cruise 7 would delegate, or rather, this bill would delegate expansive rulemaking authority to Secretary Buttigieg. And I believe it is critical that the safety benefits of each new rule or regulation exceed the costs. My amendment would bring needed certainty to the process of analyzing and justifying impacts of regulation taken in the name of railroad safety. The present bill relies on an executive order alone as the basis for regulatory analysis related to rulemakings. That, unfortunately, is not a sufficient check on the federal government, particularly with this administration. Since President Biden's first day in office, this administration has sought to repurpose the regulatory review process to advance left-wing partisan priorities such as, quote, environmental justice and, quote, unquote, equity. To that end, the Office of Management and Budget is currently revising its circular on regulatory analysis. The proposed revisions would emphasize the, quote, social cost of carbon, include even alleged foreign benefits of domestic rules with real cost on Americans, and deliberately overestimate the long-term benefits of rules to more easily overcome the short-term cost of implementation. Without a check in this bill itself, the administration will be able to distort facts and figures to advance their partisan priorities and interests. I think it's essential to consider the quantifiable benefits, especially with a focus on safety, for every new rule arising from the bill. But if the costs exceed the benefits, then a rule is more harmful than it is beneficial. These principles are fundamental. When government requires railroad to adhere to new rules, they should be cost-effective in advancing safety. My amendment would ensure that the Secretary of Transportation only issues rules, requirements, and regulations under this act after determining that the safety benefits of such actions exceed their costs that are borne by American consumers. And I urge my colleagues to support this common sense amendment.
Opposing the Cruz amendment, I dispute the idea that the regulation in this bill is burdensome. I'm not alone. Many organizations representing customers of railroads have issued statements in support of this legislation. These customers are sophisticated businesses and know what may occur as the result of this bill. However, preventing derailments and keeping their products safe is also very important to them. The major rulemakings under this bill are subject to the cost-benefit analysis contained in Executive Order 12866, which was issued by President Clinton in 1993 and used by both Democrat and Republican administrations. However, this amendment would create an entirely new cost-benefit analysis framework, but would jeopardize the core of this bill, which is safety. And we have plenty of examples, such as the aviation industry, when we know when these kinds of safety agencies aren't involved with the business impacts. We need safety to be a top priority, as my colleague from Ohio said. With safety being the core of this bill, I cannot support this amendment. Further discussion on the Cruz amendment? If not, do you want a roll call vote?
Ask for a roll call vote.
Roll call vote.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Schatz?
No.
Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Peters? No. Ms. Baldwin? No. Ms. Duckworth? No. Mr. Tester? No. Ms. Sinema? No. Ms. Rosen? No. Mr. Lujan? No. Mr. Hickenlooper? No. Mr. Warnock? No. Mr. Welch? No. Mr. Cruz? Mr. Thune? Mr. Wicker, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Moran, Mr. Sullivan, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Young, Mr. Budd, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Vance, Mrs. Capito, Ms. Lummis, Ms. Cantwell. The noes are 15, the yeses are 12.
The amendment fails. Are there further amendments?
Madam Chairman.
Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to call up Blackburn 1. And this is an amendment that does deal with safety. You have said safety is the core of this bill, and I think this amendment would strengthen the bill. Now, the current regulatory structure at the FRA makes deploying new technologies very difficult, while the existing waiver program has been grounded. In one recent example of this, the FRA refused to extend a waiver to allow a Class 1 railroad to expand its use of new technology despite a 90% improvement in safety outcomes. This action was so egregious, a court found the agency's actions to be arbitrary, vacated the decision, and sent it back to the agency. In fact, Secretary Buttigieg called on the freight railroads to deploy new inspection technologies like automated track inspection to keep the nation's railroads safe. It shouldn't be this hard to improve safety through new innovative technology. That is why my amendment will allow railroads to submit a safety innovation plan as part of the Railroad Risk Reduction Plan. Once approved, the railroad would be free to pursue these innovative approaches as long as it demonstrates an equivalent or better level of safety. By supporting innovation in new technology rather than relying on outdated standards, we can accomplish our goals by achieving the highest level of rail safety. Again, if we truly want to say the focus is on railroad safety in this country, we ought to consider new technologies that will speed the process of getting us there.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Opposing the amendment, I think I come from one of the most innovative states in the country, and I like innovation. But it doesn't mean that innovation can be a substitute for safety regulation. The regulators still need to do their job. We saw with the MAX 737 what happens when safety regulators don't do that. So I want to be clear about what this amendment does. It allows the railroads to show the Secretary that they have information and data and technology, and that the Secretary, using only some of that data, would then approve the plan for moving the railroad forward. So I am pro-technology and I am pro-innovation, but we still need to have a regulatory process in which the oversight exists with FRA and others to look at the instances of what happened in East Palestine and to make sure that we're implementing safety regulations. So I urge my colleagues to oppose what I think would gut the underlying authority. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Peters? No. Ms. Baldwin? No. Ms. Duckworth? No. Mr. Tester? No. Ms. Sinema? No. Ms. Rosen? No. Okay. Mr. Lujan? No. Mr. Hickenlooper? No. Mr. Warnock?
No by proxy.
Mr. Welch? Mr. Cruz?
Aye.
Mr. Thune? Aye. Mr. Wicker? Aye. Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Moran?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Sullivan?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn?
Aye.
Mr. Young?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Budd? Mr. Schmidt? Mr. Vance? Mrs. Capito? Ms. Lummis? Ms. Cantwell?
No.
The noes are 14, the yeses are 13.
Amendment fails. Further amendments?
Madam Chairman,
Yes. Senator Lummis.
I call up Lummis 1. Madam Chairman, this amendment would remove the requirement for a two-man crew for Class 1 railroads. While I appreciate this version no longer applies that requirement to Class 2 and Class 3 railroads, this requirement will only add costs for shippers, decrease scheduled pickups due to crew shortages, which is a huge problem in Wyoming, and most importantly, will not provide safety benefits. Both the Biden and Obama DOTs have attempted to finalize a minimum crew size rulemaking, and neither one was able to identify data that supports the assertion that two-member crews are safer than one. We need not look further than the incident at East Palestine, where the train had 3 crew members on board. Shippers in my home state of Wyoming have struggled with their scheduled pickups for nearly 2 years, and the primary factor behind the reliability issues for railroads is the lack of crew. This provision will only exacerbate those issues moving forward. While I will not be seeking a roll call vote on this amendment, I could not let a provision that I believe is better suited for a collective bargaining agreement rather than a railway safety bill go unaddressed. Congress cannot become the arbiter of labor disputes in the transportation sector, and this provision puts us squarely back in that position once again. It is my hope that as this bill progresses, we can find a way to address rail safety that does not intertwine us in negotiations between the unions and management. Madam Chairman, before I withdraw Lummis 1, I would like to compliment the gentleman from Ohio for his tireless work on behalf of the people of East Palestine, who really needed a strong advocate for the issues they encountered. And with their junior senator from the state of Ohio, they certainly got one. My compliments, Senator Vance. With that, Madam Chairman, I withdraw Lummis 1.
Further amendments?
Madam Chair.
Senator Thune.
Madam Chair, just a couple of quick observations. And the relationship between railroads in the state of South Dakota through the years has been what I would characterize as an uneven one. You know, there are, throughout our state's history, examples of the state having to become involved. And I, in my job, my current job, I had a previous job as a state rail director for the state of South Dakota, at times had to go on the warpath against the railroads when it came to service issues, when it came to rate issues. But that relationship is a symbiotic one. We have to have railroads in South Dakota. We're an agricultural state. We ship tons and tons and tons of agricultural products by rail. In the late 1970s, the cost of regulation put the railroads out of business. And so when some of the railroads went bankrupt, they abandoned thousands of miles of railroad in the state of South Dakota. And the state of South Dakota, knowing that it didn't have any options, levied a tax on the people of South Dakota to buy the railroads. And so South Dakota went into the railroad business, and we were in that business for about 20 years. And so as eventually we were able to get that turned back over to the private sector, but we learned a lot of lessons about, obviously, what the cost of regulation can do to the cost of moving a bushel of wheat to its ultimate destination. And so, you know, I approach these issues with a lot of caution, clearly with an eye on safety, which is what this legislation is about. And I think it's crucial that Norfolk Southern be held accountable and that we make what I think are pragmatic reforms that are responsive to what we've learned about the factors contributing to the East Palestine derailment. Potential requirements for defect detectors and updates to emergency response procedures are worthwhile, and I support the inclusion of those provisions in the bill. Otherwise, there's not much in the proposed legislation that would address the root cause of the derailment in East Palestine based on what we know so far. The bill imposes a 2-crew mandate. As was already been mentioned, there are 3 crew members on the train that derailed in East Palestine. The bill devotes new regulatory authority and research to long trains and block crossings. Neither of these factors were remotely related to the derailment. The bill imposes several new pre-departure periodic and locomotive inspection requirements. Some changes to pre-departure inspections should be considered since there's a possibility it was relevant to the underlying cause of the derailment. But the expansion of other unrelated inspections will just impose new requirements without any proven safety benefit. This bill should have been about safety reforms relevant to the derailment in East Palestine. But now, it's been expanded to a stalking horse for onerous regulatory mandates and union giveaways. If the intent was to punish the railroads for their mistakes, this bill misses the mark. Instead, this bill will disproportionately affect the small shippers and their customers that I referred to earlier. My amendment strikes the provision in the bill that has an authorization, an unlimited authorization, to basically provide funding to commuter railroads, passenger railroads, and what I would simply say about that is the commuter railroads in this country share a lot of track with freight railroads. Why would they need a new grant program to comply? And if we need any evidence of the potential to raise costs across the network, the insertion of this program is a perfect example. The affected track, subject to the bill's requirements and shared with commuter railroads, makes up a tiny fraction of the overall network. If commuter railroads need funding over the next 5 years for their small share, imagine how much this is going to cost the rail network broadly. So I find this provision, both the basis and the structure, unacceptable, which is why I submitted an amendment with Senator Cruz to strike the program. This new funding would be on top of the tens of billions of dollars that commuter railroads have received in the IIJA. How much more could they possibly need? Now, originally, this was going to be a $200 million program paid for. Now, it's an unlimited authorization, granted subject to annual appropriations. But my experience around here is when you put authorizations in place and they're subject to appropriations, and particularly if there's no cap, there's no lid on how much could be spent for this particular program. That strikes me as probably not a really smart, wise use of taxpayer dollars, especially at a time when we're running a $31 trillion deficit. This would be borrowed money. This would be deficit spending. It could be hundreds of millions of dollars, uncapped, without limit, basically to subsidize a very small share of the rail network in this country that has already received billions and billions and billions of dollars through previous legislation. So I move to strike that provision in the bill and ask for the committee to support it. I yield.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Thune. Opposing the amendment. I don't doubt Senator Thune's sincerity about this issue as it relates to a grower community and getting product on the rails. I face the same challenges in the state of Washington. And continuing to move product and figure out how to do it cost effectively when, as you know, a lot of product got pushed off of the rails or made more expensive by us moving new product, particularly on the fuel side, has been a big challenge. It's been documented in a well-established report by the then Energy Secretary about the challenges we face going forward. But this is about finding solutions. I disagree with your characterization of the bill. It is really focused, I think, on three things that strengthen the important aspects of what we learned from East Palestine. First and foremost, that vinyl chloride carried by the trains in East Palestine have to be recognized. This was not recognized in the previous iterations of safety plans or safety hazards. So first and foremost, we're saying vinyl chloride has to be part of a plan discussed and proposed in the plan, and the state, like a state of Ohio, deserves to know. They deserve to know, and they deserve to have firefighters and responders know how to respond to that. So we are giving Governor DeWine what he asked for. Second of all, it improves the detector system. One of the key things that was said about this is that if we would have known a little sooner on the detectors and on the heat that might have been happening, we might have been able to stop the train. So the fact that we're moving for more detectors and basically which are showing the failure of the train, to me, is one of the reasons why I don't think we have the railroad industry yelling at us. They realize that it is a safety issue, and they like the fact that we're going to mandate more detectors. And it improves the system for the first responders. As my colleague from Ohio adequately said, you know, I have to say, sir, you've come to the Senate and you've hit the ground running. And I appreciate that, because you are responding to a crisis that happened in your state, and you're responding on behalf of your citizens so that this doesn't happen again. So the fact that now emergency response plans are going to cover the very issue that East Palestine had to deal with, to me, is one of the best aspects of this bill. I get that this other issue may be bogging down people as it relates to the issue of the crews. Innovation is going to continue to happen. This bill doesn't make ultimate decisions about that. It just says for now that when this crisis happened, every man on that train was needed. Every single person was needed to respond to that crisis. And that is why we're going to keep moving forward on this. Commuter rails.
Madam Chair.
Yes, if I could just one more second. Commuter rails own thousands of miles of track in the United States, and it's very common for them to allow the freighter community to use those rails. However, those commuter railroads have contracts with the freight railroads that require them to pay for any infrastructure improvements that the freight railroads need in order to meet safety regulations. So this legislation requires Class 1 railroads to have those defect detection devices that I just mentioned, because we are trying to reduce the East Palestine situation from happening again. So however, commuter railroads have significantly smaller operating budgets, especially commuter railroads who are struggling to really deal with a past pandemic environment. And so I think that this underlying bill is very important, and I oppose this amendment. Yes, yep. Senator Vance.
Madam Chair, I just want to address a couple of points that Senator Thune made, and I appreciate his engagement on this issue. But so first, this question of the unlimited money that's allegedly going to the commuter rail system, it's in fact $50 million per year, $250 million over 5 years that's going to commuter rails. And we put this provision in, frankly, as a concession to some of the people operating these rails, because while we're encouraging them to put hot box detectors that will help prevent future East Palestines from happening, we thought it was important to actually reimburse them for the cost of doing it. We're not just sending money to the commuter rail system, we're paying the operators of these systems to install the hot box detectors that we're requiring them to operate. And again, that's a critical component of identifying these defects before they actually cause the type of crash that happened in East Palestine. That's the first point that I want to make. The second point I want to make is you know, as Senator Thune points out, look, I agree with Senator Thune on the importance of protecting all of our agricultural shippers in our communities, the fertilizers, all of the materials, the raw materials that go into growing Americans' food. It's an important part. It's why we've tried to design this legislation in a way that minimizes the harm on those groups so that we don't have increased food costs and we don't have massive problems related to our supply chain. I think the changes that we've made to the bill are part of the reason why. We've got the American Chemistry Council, the fertilizer lobby, the Rail Shippers Alliance, the Industrial Shippers Alliance, the National Association of Chemical Distributors, all are supporting our legislation. So if our legislation was going to be so terrible for the fertilizer and chemical shippers, why are all of them supporting it? The reason is because it's a reasonable, narrowly tailored intervention into the rail safety system. They believe in rail safety. Our residents need it. And so I'd encourage folks not to vote for this amendment.
Just, if I might, Madam Chair,
yes, Senator.
My understanding is, in the current draft of the text, that there is no cap. I don't believe there's a $50 million annual amount. I think it's an unlimited authorization, which would be subject to annual appropriations, but I don't think there's any cap on it.
That's fair, Senator Thune. Sorry, I misspoke. The limit is that it can only go to the hot box detectors. There's not an unlimited number of hot box detectors these railway operators are going to be installing. So there is a limit. The limit is very narrowly tailored to the fact that we're installing hot box detectors so that we can prevent these things from happening in the future.
Paid for, I might add. Again, you got billions of dollars of resources that have been shipped to the commuter rail lines in previous legislation adopted by the Congress, much of it during the pandemic, and then subsequent reconciliation bills passed by Democrats on a party line vote. And I'm not saying, I mean, I support the emergency response improvements. The things you're talking about, I mentioned that. Those are things in the bill that I'm for. What I don't like are separate, unrelated provisions in the bill that are going to hurt small shippers and consumers. And you mentioned fertilizer. There are. I mean, Chem Council, some of those support the bill. But there are lots of agricultural groups who are the ultimate end users who bear the brunt because those costs all get passed on. It's all part of the transportation basis when you ship a product. And when you live in a place like South Dakota, and I mentioned it, I mean, we are dependent upon the railroads. Whether our state likes it or not is the most efficient way to ship bulk commodities. If you put it on a truck, it'd take 3.5 trucks to make up for one rail car. And you're basically asking, again, freight railroads in that part of the country to subsidize something that's going to benefit passenger rail, commuter rail. And we're not talking about big, rich shippers here. We're talking about small ag shippers. That's what I'm talking about.
Senator, I want to address that point, and it's a fair point, and I appreciate the concern there. There are a number of agricultural communities, small and big, in the state of Ohio, and a lot in East Palestine. They bear the costs when railways set off a chemical bomb in their community, which is exactly what happened a couple of months ago. Those costs have been socialized onto Ohio and American taxpayers. The question is not whether the money's out there. The money is being spent to pick up the burden and to pay for the cleanup of these rail failures. What I'm suggesting is, instead of socializing onto the Ohio and American taxpayers, let's put it on the railways where most of the onus of this is. Look, I'd be fine if we wanted to strip this provision out and actually just provide a full mandate that these railways install hot box detectors every 10 miles. We took that provision out and provided the subsidy instead as a concession to the railway operators.
But it is, to your point, it is socializing that cost because it is the taxpayers. These are unauthorized amounts subject to annual appropriations.
There's a very tiny amount that's appropriated here, again, as a concession to the operators. The overall bill massively reduces the socialized cost problem, which is a big issue in the rail industry. A lot of socialized costs out there, a lot of American taxpayers bearing the brunt of what the railways should be doing themselves.
Thank you. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Klobuchar?
No.
Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Markey? No. Mr. Peters? No. Ms. Baldwin? No. Ms. Duckworth? No. Mr. Tester? No. Ms. Sinema? No. Ms. Rosen? No. Mr. Lujan? No. Mr. Hickenlooper? No. Mr. Warnock? No. Mr. Welch? No. Mr. Cruz?
Aye.
Mr. Thune? Aye. Mr. Wicker?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Moran?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Sullivan?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Young?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Budd? Aye. Mr. Schmidt? Aye. Mr. Vance? Mrs. Capito? Aye. Ms. Lummis?
Aye by proxy.
Ms. Cantwell?
No.
The noes are 15, the yeses are 12.
I know that members I would like to, if there's no further discussion on amendments, I'd like to go back to Senator Vance's original motion. I know that members might want to make further statements about the bill. I would ask, because we have several people who are about to leave, if the senator, if somebody wants to make that, if they could make it after this vote. Good. So the motion, and I think there's a roll call requested on the Vance motion for final passage of this legislation.
That's right, Madam Chair.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Klobuchar?
Aye.
Mr. Schatz? Aye. Mr. Markey? Aye. Mr. Peters? Aye. Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Ms. Duckworth? Aye. Mr. Tester? Aye. Ms. Sinema? Aye. Ms. Rosen? Aye. Mr. Lujan? Aye. Mr. Hickenlooper? Aye. Mr. Warnock? Aye. Mr. Welch? Aye. Mr. Cruz?
No.
Mr. Thune? Mr. Wicker?
No by proxy.
Mrs. Fisher? Mr. Moran?
No by proxy.
Mr. Sullivan?
No by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn?
No by proxy.
Mr. Young?
No by proxy.
Mr. Budd? Mr. Schmidt? Mr. Vance? Mrs. Capito?
No by proxy.
Ms. Lummis?
No by proxy.
Ms. Cantwell?
Aye.
The yeses are 16, the noes are 11.
The legislation is agreed to. I now call on Ranking Member Cruz for further motion.
Madam Chair, I move that S229, the Securing Semiconductor Supply Chain Act of 2023, S1414, the National Weather Service Communications Improvement Act, and S1416, the NOAA Weather Radio Modernization Act, be reported favorably.
Is there a second? All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. The motion is agreed to. I now recognize Senator Cruz for further motion.
Madam Chair, I move that S1280, the Trank Research Act of 2023, as amended by the Cruz substitute, Capito 1 as modified, Capito 2 as modified, and Capito 5 as modified, and S1284, the Tornado Act, as amended by the Wicker substitute and Sullivan 1, be reported favorably.
Is there a second? All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The motion is agreed to. I now recognize Senator Cruz for a further motion.
Madam Chair, I move that PN 440, Coast Guard promotions, be reported favorably.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. The motion is agreed to. We've now concluded, thank you to all our members, the actual voting. Any member wishing to speak now be recognized. Senator
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank the ranking member, the chair, and Senator Vance for their work on the Railway Safety Act. And I know that there's more work ahead on this. But, you know, I grew up in a working class neighborhood and had friends whose parents worked on the railroad. I have friends and neighbors who are firefighters. And when I ran for the Senate, I promised to fight for the forgotten men and women of this country. The people like those who have suffered in East Palestine, Ohio, and by the way, in towns just like that in Missouri. So it's my pleasure to support Senator Vance in this bill here today, and knowing there's work to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Further statements? If not, I'm going to submit some statements for the record in response to your amendment on LNG, but that concludes our hearing today. The committee is adjourned.